Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the editor of the New Books Network. And if you're listening to the New Books Network, I imagine you like to read. And I'm wondering if you have a goal to read more this year. How about a goal to read more of what you love and less of what you don't? The Proofread podcast is here to help. Hosted by Casey and Tyler, two English professors and avid readers with busy lives, Proofread helps you decide what books are worth spending your precious time on and what books aren't. They feature 15-minute episodes that give you everything you need to know about a book to decide if you should read it or skip it. You'll get a brief synopsis, fun and witty commentary, no spoilers, and no sponsored reviews. It's just what Casey and Tyler think. Life's too short to read a bad book, so subscribe to the Proofread podcast today. And by the way, there's a new season coming. Thanks very much.
Think Verizon, the best 5G network, is expensive? Think again. Bring in your AT&T or T-Mobile bill to a Verizon store today and we'll give you a better deal. Now, what to do with your unwanted bills? Ever seen an origami version of the kissing statue? Jokes aside, Verizon has the most ways to save on phones and plans where everyone in the family can choose their own plan and save. So bring in your bill to your local San Diego Verizon store today and we'll give you a better deal. Rankings based on Root Metric True Score report dated 1H 2025. Your results may vary. Must provide a postpaid consumer mobile bill dated within the past 45 days. Bill must be in the same name as the person living the deal. Additional terms apply.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner. However you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running is all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I'm Ursula Hackett of the New Books Network, New Books in Public Policy podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Andrea Campbell of MIT, the author of Taxation and Resentment, Race, Party and Class in American Tax Attitudes, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted that you're here to talk to me, partly because we are, long-standing colleagues, but also because this is just an extraordinary book and I enjoyed reading it very much. It's rich, informative account of American public opinion on taxes. It's beautifully written and it utilizes both historical and original modern data and statistical analysis in order to really drill down to the individual level on tax attitudes into different types of taxes, which I hope we'll get onto in our conversation, and also to examine how partisanship and racial attitudes and self-interest either do or do not significantly really shape people's tax views. And I thought in particular, the findings that you had about Black and Hispanic taxpayers in particular were absolutely fascinating. I'm hoping we're going to have a chance to talk about them later today. So it's an incredible achievement. I congratulate you on this book. And I wondered if we could start by talking just in outline about the American tax system and how it came to be and develop as it did in a country that is famously devoted to a kind of rugged individualism and skeptical of government power.
Yes, well, thank you for that question. So many of the taxes that Americans pay today are really developed in the early 20th century. Prior to that, it was mostly tariffs. The federal government was very, very small in scope. State and local governments were really larger, and they got their revenues mostly from property taxes and so on. That all starts to change in the 20th century, and estate taxes added. The individual income tax, which is the focus of so much American tax politics, is initiated in 1913, although it's really World War II that becomes a tax that most people pay. And then other taxes are added over time. During the Great Depression, the social welfare state develops in the United States, and a payroll tax is introduced, a gas tax as well. Property taxes are given from state governments to local governments, continue as the primary source of local government revenue, and then states institute their own income taxes, oftentimes in the 1930s, and also state sales taxes, which are one of the main consumption taxes that we have in the United States. So we never get a VAT, unlike most other countries in the world. Instead, we have this array of taxes at every level of government. Americans are taxed at federal, state, local government by this array of many, many different types of taxes.
So, I mean, it is interesting you mentioned the VAT, because, of course, a lot of other countries, including my own country of Britain, have this value added tax where you're basically taxing the value that's added at each stage of the production process. And the US doesn't have that. So could you delve into a bit more? Why is that? Why does the US never develop a VAT?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And part of the reason owes to what you mentioned before, that the US is a very individualistic country, wants a small public sector, low taxes. VATs were adopted in many peer nations in, say, the 1960s, and we did not. And if you look, in fact, at total taxes as share of GDP, the US was not that different than, say, the rich democracies of Europe in terms of, taxes in the 1960s. But then there's a divergence. U.S. taxes stay pretty flat. Tax revenues go up in these other countries. It helps fund more extensive social protections than what we have in the United States. In the U.S., we never get those extensive social protections, in part because of our fraught racial history. So there was never sort of a need for a new source of revenue, especially not a robust one like a consumption tax. And in the early days, going back to the early 20th century, there was some talk of having a consumption tax during the Great Depression, for example, but it never came to fruition. And instead, at the dawn of federal taxation, especially the income tax in 1913, the idea was that industrialization has created these very large fortunes, and that the tax system should be oriented toward an ability to pay principal, that those with more should fund the government because they were better able to do so, and that would be fair and just given what market incomes were being generated by industrialization. So early on, there was the establishment that we should have progressive taxation, especially at the federal level. Therefore, the VAT sort of never fit in with that orientation. Now, that said, a big part of the book is the rest of the history of American tax policy, and especially the politics around taxation, is owing to the choice of progressive taxation, especially at the federal level. Because with progressive taxation, of course, you're taxing the most organized, vocal, high-resource parts of society, and they have spent the subsequent 100 years trying to get their effective tax rates reduced, which is a large reason why we have the politics that we have today in the U.S. around taxes.
That's fantastic. And I think I'd like to drill again into this question of progressivity, because, of course, as you say, it's this really crucial part of the argument that you're making in the book. And I think it's wonderful to reflect on that history of progressivity in past times. I wonder if you could just quickly take our listeners through, how did that progressivity erode? What was happening in that intervening period that takes us up to the modern period of tax?
Yeah, in the early days, the federal income tax was highly progressive because only the top decile, the top 10% of income earners paid it. And then it became a tax that most people paid during World War II because of the great revenue needs of the war effort. But it remained progressive with brackets and higher tax rates imposed at higher income levels. And the rich and the highly affluent sought to reduce progressivity in two main ways. One is seeking reduced tax rates, so trying to get those top marginal tax rates reduced. They were highly effective. Taxes tend to go up during wartime and then were immediately pulled back in the post-war periods. We had several rounds of that after World War I, after World War II, after Korea. So trying to get the tax rates reduced at the high end. The Reagan Revolution was key in that, because in the 1970s, the top marginal rate had been 70%, and Ronald Reagan reduced that to 28%. So that was one technique they used to reduce their effective rates of taxation. The other is that the rich and the affluent sought out tax breaks, and the federal income tax in the U.S. is just riddled with all sorts of credits, deductions, preferable rates for certain types of income, other kinds of exclusions that remove income from taxation. And many people in the U.S. benefit from some of these tax breaks. For example, unlike many countries, we tend to get our health insurance through employers rather than the government. In the U.S., there's no tax imposed on those health insurance premiums. So that's an example of a tax break that goes to a wide swath of Americans. But if you look at the overall value of these tax breaks, and the whole system is called the tax expenditure system, if you look at the total value, it disproportionately goes to the top 10%, the top 1%, and then finer and finer gradations of the top 1%. So what's happened is that both the reduction of the rates and the introduction of all of these breaks means that the effective rate of taxation has fallen at the high end. And so the federal income tax remains progressive, but far less progressive than it was in the past. And by the past, I mean prior to the Reagan Revolution that starts in the 1980s. And then on the state and local side, the tax system has always been highly regressive because that's where we have sales taxes, the consumption tax I mentioned before. And so state and local tax system was regressive, has become more regressive over time. And altogether, our tax system, when you combine those, every level of government, is almost flat. It is the case that higher earners pay a greater share of their income than low earners, but not that much more compared to their share of income.
So this brings us to the central puzzle that you're dealing with in this work, and that is the question of progressive taxation and the extent to which, on the one hand, Americans profess enthusiasm for the abstract ideal of progressive taxation, the idea that higher income groups should pay higher rates and help fund the government on a sort of ability to pay principle that you mentioned. But on the other hand, those same non-rich, ordinary Americans don't necessarily like progressive taxes in practice. So I wonder whether you could just give us a sense of how you attack that central problem in your book.
Yeah, it's this fascinating paradox because many ordinary Americans, the non-rich, do adhere strongly to the theory of progressive taxation. That is what they want in the abstract. In my survey data, I describe different kinds of tax systems to the survey respondents, and large majority say they prefer the progressive system as opposed to a regressive system or a flat system. And large majorities also want the rich to pay more. But then when you turn from those abstract theoretical preferences to their preferences on individual taxes, yes. So when you look at their attitudes towards specific taxes, the taxes they dislike the most and most want to see decreased are the progressive taxes. The income tax, the estate tax, the capital gains tax. And strangely, the taxes that they object to the least are the ones that cost them more as a share of income, especially the state sales tax, which for the bottom 60% of Americans actually comes to a higher share of their income per year than the federal income tax. And so in other words, Americans' tax attitudes are upside down in two respects. Their individual tax attitudes don't match up with their abstract preferences, nor do they match up with their self-interest. They literally like taxes that cost them more and dislike taxes that cost them less.
So, it strikes me that it's quite the line between sort of objective fact and sort of normative position becomes a bit harder to draw when you're dealing with these sort of contestable concepts like self-interest or fairness or proportionality. One of the things that really struck me that you talk about in your book is you note that Republicans and conservatives are more likely to characterize regressive taxes as proportional on the basis that everyone pays the same, right? So, you're saying, well, how do we sort of understand that idea of proportionality, I suppose, is sort of the thing in question there. Or, for example, also elsewhere in the book, and it's a different context, but I think pays into this question about how the rich typically see the government as an obstacle rather than as a provider of functions, whether that's security securing property rights or maintaining markets and so on. And then the question sort of arises about whether this is, lack of knowledge or ideological commitment or sort of willful disregard, or, how you would sort of go about characterizing that. And so I think I want to know a bit more about how you understand these concepts of self-interest and proportionality and fairness when these things are so deeply contested as a matter of ideological conflict.
Absolutely. Well, fairness is always in the eye of the beholder. And this phenomenon of Republican respondents saying that these regressive taxes like the sales tax are fair is completely fascinating to me. And again, it goes back to this notion of individualism. And there's a couple things going on here. One is that many of my survey respondents, especially Republicans, although not only respondents, feel very strongly that everyone should pay something. So there's a lot of resentment toward the federal income tax where low earners are removed from that system, right? Because it's unfair in many people's eyes that some pay nothing. And so one reason that the sales tax is more positively viewed is that it's difficult to escape. Everyone goes into a store and buys an item and pays the sales tax. No one can escape it. And it's true that both the low-income people can't escape it, but also high-income people, right? Because one source of resentment in the U.S. is that high-income people seem to be able to slip the bounds of the income tax system with all of their tax planning and taking advantage of all these credits and so on. So this notion that everybody pays is very strong. The other notion, and this gets to the proportionality or flat respect, is many people also like the fact that, say, the sales tax, not only does everyone pay, but everyone pays the same rate. Regardless of your income, in my state of Massachusetts, you go into a store and buy an item and everyone pays the 6.25% sales tax. And that too has an appeal to many people, especially Republicans, as I found in my survey data, because there's something about everyone paying the same also seems fair. And part of it also might have to do with the complications of math, that it's difficult to comprehend taxes as a share of income, and that these taxes that appear to be flat or proportional because the rate is flat are much more of a burden for lower income people. So part of it, I think, is comprehension and cognition, but part of it is this ideological commitment to the fact that everyone pays the same. Everyone is contributing to the public purse. We're not differentiating amongst ourselves with these kinds of flat rate taxes. So that appeals to many Americans, and especially Republicans, as I find.
Vrbo helps you swap gift wrap time for quality time. Go to Vrbo now and book a last-minute week-long stay and save over $390 this holiday season. Book your next vacation rental home on Vrbo. Average savings $396. Select homes only.
So good, so good, so good.
Score holiday gifts everyone wants for way less at your Nordstrom Rack store. Save on UGG, Nike, Rag & Bone, Vince, Frame, Kurt Geiger London, and more.
Because there's always something new.
I'm giving all the gifts this year with that extra 5% off when I use my Nordstrom credit card. Santa who?
Join the Nordy Club at Nordstrom Rack to unlock our best deals. It's easy. Big gifts, big perks. That's why you rack.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Gift magical mornings with Nespresso Virtuo Pop. Compact and stylish, Virtuo Pop is made to meet every morning coffee craving. From espresso to coffee, hot or iced, at the click of a button. And celebrate the season with Nespresso's limited edition coffee flavors. Sweet almond and hibiscus, cinnamon and candied tamarind, and festive double espresso. Magic in the making. Shop the holiday gift collection exclusively at Nespresso.com.
I want to come back to this question of the ability of the rich to manipulate their share as in relation to some of the things that your respondents said about the sales tax. Because on the one hand, you know, and one of the things that's wonderful about this book, I should say to everybody, is that you're drawing in sort of freestyle open responses that real people are talking about in relation to how they understand taxes. So you get a really rich sense of what are people actually thinking under the hood, as it were. And one of the things that your respondents say about sales taxes is that the rich can't manipulate that share, right? So there's no loopholes to not pay. Everyone bumps into it. No one can evade it. Those are the sorts of things that people are saying. But then they do also say that the sales tax is very controllable. Like, don't want to pay the tax, don't buy the item. And I'm just wondering how we can sort of reconcile those different understandings of the sales tax.
That's right. In some respect, people are thinking about what are others paying, and that's why they like the fact that everyone has to pay the sales tax, right, relative to the affluent and the rich. The controllable part is also very interesting because many taxes feel uncontrollable to people, that you pay, the payroll tax and the income tax is withheld from your paycheck. You have no control over how much you pay in those taxes unless you just choose to work less, which might be difficult for many people. The property tax also is not responsive to your income. If you lose your job, you still owe property tax on your house, or if you retire, you still owe the same property tax on your house. So those are, not responsive to people's circumstances, whereas people feel that with the sales tax, they have choice. And so some of the tax attitudes I find people are thinking about what are others paying and how fair is that? Some of the attitudes and some of the reasons why people have their views are more about their own situation and how they feel about their own burden. And so that's where we're getting this differentiation, I think, between some people liking the sales tax because the rich can't escape it, and some people liking the sales tax because they feel that they can control how much they owe.
That's so interesting. And I mean, I suppose another consideration for people is what people ultimately expect to get back from the system. And one of the things I thought was quite striking in relation to your work on the Social Security payroll tax, where it's obviously very costly for a lot of income groups, and yet it's seen as the least unfair tax. And that's an interesting juxtaposition because people in the survey say they eventually expect to get back what they put in through the benefits in older age, and they seem to be taking a longer term view of that tax. And so I suppose, and it comes back to this question of how we define self-interest. We're thinking about it here in a very short-term way, but perhaps people's understanding of that tax, and maybe some of the other taxes in your account are just taking a longer-term view of self-interest. I mean, over a lifetime. What do you think about that?
Right. Well, I think that's definitely most apparent in the payroll tax. So many other taxes, it's very difficult to see where the money goes. That's especially true of taxes at the federal level. Those revenues just seem to go into this big pot of money to the evil federal government, and who knows how they're going to use it. Some of the local and state taxes, especially the sales tax. Another reason why the sales tax is relatively more acceptable to many Americans is that it is a state tax. People feel more positively toward their state governments than the national government. And you can feel, and some people say with property tax, even those who feel relatively less negative about the property tax, at least it goes to local fire and police, or it goes to local public schools. You can see your tax dollars being used. That relationship with tax dollars being associated with a visible benefit is most apparent with the payroll tax. The way that the payroll tax was sold historically to Americans was this individual contract with government. You pay this money in over your working life. You will get a benefit in retirement. The benefit is tied somewhat to your earnings. So, higher income people get a higher benefit, although the replacement rates are better for lower income people. But it's seen by Americans as this sacrosanct contract between worker and government. And the benefits are highly visible. Everyone knows about Social Security, pension benefits, and retirement. It enabled people to retire because prior to that system being established during the Great Depression, older people just lived with their families or kept working until they could no longer work. That is one of the few earmarked taxes in the U.S. system where people can draw this direct line between taxes paid and benefits received, which is why, even though it's a highly regressive tax and quite expensive for many Americans, in fact, 3/4 of Americans pay more in payroll tax every year than income tax. Now, most of them don't realize that, but also they get a benefit, a very visible benefit in return, and that makes the tax relatively more acceptable.
I mean, let's talk about visibility, because one of the things that you've already mentioned in this conversation, and which I have an interest in as well, is this question of the tax breaks and tax expenditure system. I mean, you really hammer home, I think, some fascinating information about the system of tax breaks in the US, in particular, the enormous size of this tax expenditure system. I think it's incredible to reflect upon the fact that the amount of federal revenues not collected because of tax breaks nearly equals, and at times has exceeded, the amount that is collected by the individual income tax. And you cite in the book Vanessa Williamson's finding that filling out federal tax forms every April gives taxpayers this sort of glimpse of how many breaks they can't benefit from, reminds them that others are maybe being taxed less. And I wondered how that finding fits in with some of the work that's been done by Suzanne Mettler and others on the submerged state, where it's all about what people know or think they know about state benefits and what makes them really, really angry. I mean, is it that they don't recognize tax expenditures as a government benefit, which is kind of the submerged state line, but they think that direct spending is going to others? Or is it that they're angry because they do recognize tax expenditures as government benefits, but they just don't think they're going to be able to collect them themselves? I just wondered if you could untangle that a bit for us. I think it's a really interesting thought.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's wonderful work by Suzanne Mettler and Chris Farrisee and some other folks looking at the tax expenditure system, oftentimes characterizes it as the hidden welfare state or the submerged welfare state, because, as Suzanne finds, people who get benefits from a direct spending program, say public housing, are much more likely to say they benefit from a government program than those that get a tax break. There's a tax break in the U.S. for home mortgage interest deduction. And so she concludes from that these tax breaks, even though they're oftentimes addressed at similar public policy problems, are not recognized by the recipients. And what I find is that that's partly true and partly not true. People know a little bit about the tax break system. They know roughly, very roughly, which income groups benefit from different breaks. So, for example, people are aware that breaks for getting your health insurance through your employer or retirement benefits through your employer, they recognize that those benefits are going in part to the middle class. They don't fully comprehend the fact that upper income groups get way more of that benefit, but they do comprehend that, okay, those go to middle income groups. They also know enough to realize that the earned income tax credit, which is a subsidy for low wage workers, they recognize that goes to lower income groups. And they also recognize some of the tax breaks that disproportionately go to the rich. They realize there's a tax break for charitable contributions, and they do recognize that the high income groups disproportionately benefit from that. And they realize that the preferential, the low rate on capital gains income also benefits upper income groups. So there's some vague understanding of the distribution of taxes, not entirely correct, but vaguely correct-ish. And what's interesting is that, therefore, their attitudes toward these breaks, which ones they want to see enhanced or reduced, roughly mirror their attitudes towards direct spending programs. So political scientists for many years have studied attitudes towards direct spending programs, and many, especially white Americans, tend to disapprove of spending on means-tested programs that are targeted at lower-income people, and like spending that's done on the middle class. And I find that the tax break attitudes mirror that, that the programs are perceived as going to lower-income people, like the EITC, also the child tax credit, interestingly, though there's more enthusiasm for cutting those than there is enthusiasm for cutting the breaks that go to the middle class. And the one other element here is the role of racial resentment. So if I focus on white Americans, those who harbor more animus toward non-white people, a few things interesting about them. One is that they dislike progressive taxes more than other whites. They want to see federal spending on low-income people, direct federal spending decreased, and they want to see tax expenditures, tax breaks for lower-income people, like the EITC or the child tax credit, decreased. And so, in other words, racial resentment is a very strong predictor of all three of the phenomena that I look at: tax attitudes, spending attitudes, and tax break or indirect spending attitudes.
So racial resentment is taking on this enormous significance in terms of determining how people, what people's tax attitudes are. I mean, what about partisanship and ideology? I mean, people might think, well, hey, what role are they playing with respect to how people think about taxes?
Right. Well, you might think that attitudes toward taxes would be determined very strongly by partisanship in the United States. If you just look at our major political parties, the Republican Party has, for time immemorial, has been associated, it's been the small government party, right? And certainly since the 1980s and the Reagan Revolution, when Reagan puts together a kind of new coalition in the Republican Party, a desire for low taxes and lots of tax cuts is the glue that holds that coalition together. And that remains the point even today. We just had the big, beautiful bill that passed this summer features tax cuts brought to you by the Republican Party. So that's a longstanding phenomenon, right? And so you might think that Republicans in the public would always have distinctive attitudes compared to Democrats, more skepticism towards taxes than Democrats. And that is not uniformly the case. There are some exceptions, and it depends on what kind of attitude you're looking at. So, for example, if you just ask people, what's the worst tax? What are the taxes that you most dislike? Both Republicans and Democrats will cite the federal income tax, the estate tax. Interestingly, political independents, those who don't affiliate with either the Democratic or Republican Party, are particularly anti-tax. So that's quite interesting part of our politics, because those people are the proverbial swing voters. And so there is these attitudes where Republicans are skeptical about taxes, independents are even more skeptical about taxes, but a large share of Democrats too have negative feelings about taxes. Means this all politically advantages the Republican Party, because if they have an anti-tax platform, they draw votes across all three groups. So there's that. But then there's times when, or another example of when Republicans are not quite as distinctive as you might imagine. There's not great data over time on tax attitudes. In fact, I had originally wanted to do a very historical book looking at tax attitudes over time, and found that the public opinion data are just very thin if we go back in time. But there is one question that has been asked by Gallup and the General Social Survey run by sociologists since 1947, the Gallup version, which asks people simply, federal income taxes you pay this year, too high, too low, about right? And you might imagine that Republicans coming from the low tax small government party would always be more likely than Democrats to say, my federal income taxes are too high. But in fact, they only say that when there's a Democratic president. When there's a Republican president, the attitudes of Republicans and Democrats don't really differ. So it's the effect of partisanship on attitudes is very situational and very conditional, which also is quite interesting.
Did you know that at Chevron, you can fuel up on unbeatable mileage and savings? With Chevron Rewards, you'll get 25 cents off per gallon on your next 5 visits. All you have to do is download the Chevron app and join to start saving on fuel. Then you can keep fueling up on other things like adventure, memories, vacations, daycations, quality time, and so many other possibilities. Head to your nearest Chevron station to fuel up and get rewarded today. Terms apply. See ChevronTexcoRewards.com for more details.
The 7-seat Volvo EX90 is a car made for finding tranquility in traffic with a serene Scandinavian interior. Made for safely navigating the Golden State, from Big Sur to the Bay Bridge. And with intuitive technology and Google built in, it's the car made for finding the best taco truck in East LA. The fully electric Volvo EX90 is perfect for California. Visit volvocars.com/US to learn more. Google is a trademark of Google LLC.
Toast the holidays in a new way and raise a glass of rum chata. A delicious creamy blend of horchata with rum. Enjoy it over ice or in your coffee. Rum chata, your holiday cocktails just got sweeter. Tap or click the banner for more. Drink responsibly. Caribbean rum with real dairy cream, natural and artificial flavors. Alcohol 13.75% by volume, 27.5 proof. Copyright 2025 Agave Loco Brands, Pewaukee, Wisconsin. All rights reserved.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, that really is astonishing, this finding you have for independents, that they are even more likely than Republicans on basically any tax to say that it's unfair. And I mean, I just wondered, can you just expand on that? I mean, why are these independents so unbelievably anti-tax?
Yeah, well, I guess a lot of them are, the reason they're independents is they're in some ways disaffected from politics and perhaps by extension disaffected from government. And so that makes them anti-tax. Some of it may be a little bit of lower information levels. We know that independents have less political knowledge. They're less interested in politics. They follow politics less than those who say they're Democrats or Republicans. And so it may be that they simply respond to questions like this, kind of parroting the elite rhetoric that they hear. And so much of rhetoric around taxes in the US is anti-tax. So they're just repeating that. But it also is very interesting to think about just the nature of American public policy. There's been a lot of interesting work in recent years about why is it that American public policy, whether we're talking about, spending policy or tax policy, is relatively conservative. And some researchers have been looking at elected politicians and what do they think their constituents want in a variety of policy areas, and discovering that there are misperceptions that many elected politicians or their staffs tend to think their constituents are more conservative than they actually are, in part because the constituents who come forth and express their attitudes tend to be the more privileged ones who tend to be more conservative. And so a few things are going on. So one reason that public policy in the United States tends to go in this conservative direction is that there's this misperception on the part of elected politicians about what people really want. But another reason could be that just in terms of electoral incentives, if you're running for office and you need to attract not just the votes of voters in your own party, but also those independents who are such important swing voters, you can win more votes with an anti-tax, low-tax platform because you're going to attract those independent voters.
One tax we haven't really talked about yet is the estate taxes, because here you've got some really interesting puzzles there. I mean, we're having some very intense debates right now in the UK about inheritance taxes. And I actually looked up some of the figures. I mean, most Brits, 55% of Brits think that inheritance tax is unfair or very unfair, compared with fewer than 20% who say it's fair or very fair. Even though, as we know, less than 5% of estates actually ultimately attract inheritance tax. And you unearth similar opposition to estate taxes in the US. And you're finding that, even those with below median incomes who want more government spending, who say the income gap has increased and that's a bad thing, and who say that government policy contributes to differences in income, and who say rich people pay less than they should in federal income taxes, even amongst those for whom all of those things are true, they still support repeal in huge numbers of estate taxes. It's like 2/3 or something of the people for whom all of those statements are true say that we should repeal estate taxes. Tell us about this opposition. Where does it come from? Why do people hate a tax that basically nobody pays?
It is extraordinary, isn't it? And estate taxes are something that has puzzled a number of political scientists and other social scientists for a long time. It is very strange, right? Because, again, Americans at an abstract level want the rich to pay more. And yet the tax, which is the most progressive, the estate tax, is the most hated by normal Americans. So it doesn't make sense from a self-interest perspective, because they will, a tiny number of people, of Americans, pay the tax. It's fewer than 2,000 estates per year when 2 million Americans die every year, right? It's a tiny, tiny incidence. So from a self-interest point, it makes no sense. You just cited the ways in which people's other attitudes do not comport with their estate tax attitudes. If you think inequality is bad and so on, you still want the estate tax abolished. So I think there's a few things going on here. One is that governments can tax different things. You can tax income. You can tax consumption, like with a VAT or a sales tax. You can tax wealth, like the property tax or the estate tax. My survey respondents really dislike taxing wealth. The property tax, very disliked, and the estate tax, very disliked. And I think what happens is that people extrapolate from their personal experience, and they think that the way wealth is accrued is that you earn income, you don't spend all that income, you save part of it, and wealth is the natural accumulation of those savings. And because wealth derives from income in the experience of ordinary people, they think it's already been taxed, and it is unfair to tax that again. Also, people have a very strong desire to leave something for their children. And so if they have sacrificed and not spent all of their money and put something aside, they want to leave that for their children. Some people, and then a third factor is people hear that certain people who appear to be rich on paper, like farmers or small business owners, are disproportionately hit by the estate tax, and that their heirs have to liquidate, sell off the family farm or liquidate the family business to meet these tax obligations. And that's incredibly unfair, because farmers and entrepreneurs are archetypes of American individualism, right? So several things going on here. Those stories were intentionally told by rich estate tax opponents in order to foster this opposition among non-rich Americans, even though those stories of farms and businesses being sold off are largely apocryphal. So part of this is messaging from the right and estate tax opponents, which has been very successful in creating these misperceptions about how widespread the estate tax is, which we've known that before. But this notion that taxing wealth is disliked, I think, is a new thing. There's also an element here of racial attitudes. As with the other progressive taxes I study, those who harbor more racial resentment don't like the estate tax. And I think it's because estate tax revenues just go into the general revenues pot. That money might be spent on federal programs for lower income people, and that those programs are perceived as disproportionately going to non-whites. And so that's especially unfair, especially because farmers, small business owners are coded white in American rhetoric. And so the estate taxes, there's multiple reasons why ordinary Americans, even though it does not comport with their abstract preference for taxing the rich more, and certainly doesn't comport with their self-interest, there's multiple reasons why people especially dislike the estate tax, even though it strikes many of us as illogical.
I mean, I think it's fascinating that you mentioned these narratives around farmers and entrepreneurs having to liquidate the family farm and the ways in which those are coded white in terms of political rhetoric. And I was thinking, as I was reading your great book, about some of the many other works in American political development, but particularly Chloe Thurston and Emily Zakin's book about the politics of debt relief. In particular, there's their focus on the your collective focus on the sort of visibility, public awareness in distribution of politics, role of racial resentment, the construction of certain populations as being deserving versus undeserving recipients of government largesse, and the sort of power of white-coded groups like farmers to organize to protect their self-interest and also to sort of racialize state building more broadly. I was just sort of wondering how you position your work with respect to some of the other work that's being done in American political development about, you know, how certain types of financial reliefs are normalized and others are politically contested and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the Thurston Zakin book is marvelous, right? Showing how 19th century debt relief for farmers is something that becomes accepted because those farmers are white. Whereas in the 20th century, when it's consumers who are facing debt problems, those consumers are coded as out of control. What is wrong with you? You can't control your spending. That's why you're in trouble. Therefore, we are not going to forgive your debts in the way that we forgave the debts of farmers in the 19th century, because it's your fault that you're in debt. And you can see how that might be racialized with these very, very racialized perceptions in the U.S. about who controls themselves and who doesn't, right? So my book, so there's less on tax public opinion in political science than one might think. There's a seminal work by Sears and Citrin about the property tax revolt that emerges in the late 70s in California and then spreads around the nation and helps usher in the Reagan Revolution of anti-tax sentiment, and politicians in the Republican Party realizing that they can benefit electorally from emphasizing taxes and the need for tax cuts. That work looked at self-interest and discovered some aspects of self-interest in people's tax attitudes, like homeowners were more supportive of these property tax reductions than renters, but also discovered the role of racial resentment, that those who are racially resentful dislike the property tax more. So that was one early work. And there's sort of that's one reason I wanted to look at self-interest across a broad array of taxes, not just the property tax, and also the role of racial resentment in across a broad array of taxes. And then you sort of fast forward to the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s. There was a spate of work then, much of it actually around the estate tax, work by Michael Gratz and Ian Shapiro and by Larry Bartels, looking at, these puzzling estate tax attitudes. The fact that people's preferences about inequality seem to have no relationship to their dislike of the estate tax. But these, works were focused on particular taxes and particular points in time without really looking at the broad array of taxes. And so that was one motivation for the book. And then, as you know, there's this wonderful work that's being done about credit and who has and does not have credit, what are systems of bankruptcy, who is banked, who is not banked in the U.S., has access to formal financial institutions or not. And so part of the work and the fact that part of it does revolve around whites' attitudes about race that end up in sort of, infecting, for lack of a better word, so many of their tax attitudes that appear to have nothing to do with race, is very much situated in that literature about how so much of what happens in the United States gets refracted through the racial lens.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've talked quite a bit about whites' attitudes towards tax. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you find in the book about Black and Hispanic taxpayers, because I thought that was really interesting. They have some very distinctive attitudes that are related to their experiences with government coercion.
That's right. Well, another goal of this book was to look at the attitudes of Black and Latino people, because the existing work really does focus on white taxpayers and their grievances and resentments and so on. And there was almost virtually no work about, well, what about everybody else and their tax attitudes? Andrew Carl, who's an historian who looks at the property tax, has this wonderful line in his work that Black Americans especially are only viewed as the object of whites' ire and never as taxpayers in their own right. But of course, they pay taxes. And what's interesting is that there's a literature in history, in sociology, and in law, which is about the fact that Black and Latino Americans actually pay more in taxes than similarly situated white Americans, for a whole variety of both intentional and unintentional reasons. So just to give a couple of examples, these are probably unintentional, or at least were originally unintentional. If you look at the federal income tax, Black Americans are less likely to have access to the tax break system. They're less likely, for example, to have jobs where employer-provided health insurance or retirement plans are on offer. And so at the same income level, they're taxed on more of their income than white Americans, who are more likely to have untaxed income because they're enjoying those employer benefits that are not taxed. So that's one sort of subtle example. There are less subtle examples. Andrew Carl has a wonderful book called The Black Tax, about the property tax in the United States, which has had a highly disproportionate effect on Black Americans in many ways. Black Americans historically were shunted into certain neighborhoods where they were allowed to buy houses and not allowed to buy houses elsewhere. They oftentimes had to pay more for those houses because they couldn't get more favorable interest rates, because some programs from the federal government, for example, were only available to white and not Black would-be homeowners or purchasers. So Black Americans had to be in certain neighborhoods, had to pay more even to be in those neighborhoods. Then city assessors would over-assess their homes for property tax purposes. And so they're literally paying more in property tax for a similarly valued, for a house that's equivalent, right? That was all intentional. That was a way for cities to squeeze Black homeowners and have lighter taxes on white homeowners. Black Americans couldn't protest because they weren't allowed to vote. A lot of these practices emerged in the Jim Crow era. And remarkably, this is remarkable, recent analyses by Chris Berry of Chicago shows that this disproportionate property taxation continues to this day, which is extraordinary to me. And then today, there's also an additional overlay where city governments who are strapped for cash will do what are called tax auctions. If a homeowner falls behind on their property taxes, rather than working with the homeowner to, for a payment plan, they'll just put a lien on the house and then foreclose and auction off the house, and the city will take the revenues. And those kinds of practices are disproportionately visited upon Black homeowners and not white homeowners. And so there's this whole vast, fascinating literature. There's also a wonderful book by a tax scholar, Dorothy Brown, about other ways in which Black Americans are overtaxed, also Latino Americans, having to do with just the ways in which Black Americans and Latino Americans earn money, hold assets, consume, where they buy their homes. All of these things end up ultimately their disproportionate taxation at every level of government, remarkably. So I was very curious, what are their tax attitudes as a result? And so if you look at, attitudes towards government in general, Black and Latino Americans are more positive toward government, want a larger role for government. They're more likely to say they're liberal. They're more supportive of federal spending in a lot of social policy areas. But then when you look at their tax attitudes, they are more likely than white Americans to say these taxes, basically every tax is unfair. And they're more likely to say these taxes should be decreased. which is remarkable to me. And in some instances, Black Americans are more likely to say taxes should be decreased than white Republicans, which, is extraordinary. And it's not that I think there's self-interest per se going on here, because I can't really, I could never argue that like, oh, Black Americans have self-interest relative to taxes and white Americans don't. It's not quite that. It's that Black Americans have often suffered from a coercive state in the U.S. at every level of government, whether we're talking our social policy systems, certainly our judicial system is disproportionately Black Americans are the victims of disproportionate police practices and incarceration and so on. And I think what these Black survey respondents are doing is extrapolating from these very negative experiences of a coercive state to this other state practice, taxation, which is coercive for everyone, but this particular population has been the subject of more coercion in these other areas, and therefore might be more suspicious of when the tax man comes around.
This is so interesting. Andrea, I have one final question for you. In light of the fact that you've really opened up this very broad conversation about American public opinion on taxes, what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment? Where are you taking this project next? I'd love to hear more about that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, in the final part of the book, and for anyone who's a social scientist listening to this, if you're looking for hypotheses to pursue, I lay out, so many areas of tax public opinion that we need to explore. This book is really just the first bite at some of these phenomena, and so I hope that researchers will take up the mantle and explore some of the hypotheses that I raise, and that I'm able to do in a sort of initial way with this book, but certainly deserve more exploration. First and foremost, I think the tax attitudes of Black and Latino Americans. That's just untilled territory that needs more work. As for me personally, my next project, I think I may go back to, in some ways, my first book about how policies make citizens and senior citizens in the United States and how they became such super participators in American democracy, in part because of the work about taxes. I think we're going to look back in the United States and realize that for a few brief decades, we had one major social policy success, which was we alleviated poverty among senior citizens. And all those systems that we've put in place in both the public sector and the private sector are all eroding. And what's going to happen with the senior citizens of the future? And of course, there's a great deal of concern about our lack of investment in children in the United States, which is absolutely true, to our detriment. But I think, one thing that we've done, like the one's social policy success with senior citizens, and maybe we spend too much on senior citizens, but we're letting all these protections not disappear, but fall behind the need, erode. And so that's, I think, what's up next for me.
That's incredible. Andrea, thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. Everybody, the book is Taxation and Resentment, Race, Party, and Class in American Tax Attitudes. Andrea, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.